What's up, music lovers? Thank you so much for clicking on my channel, and welcome to the first episode of a series I'm going to be calling Music Notes, where I talk about a particular band or some aspect of the music industry or the process of making music, just any kind of random thing that doesn't really fit anywhere else on this channel. And before we go on, I just want to apologize for the absolutely obnoxious thumbnail with that little tagline, "You want to hear wrong about the Beatles," and I have the picture of the Beatles there like they're laughing at you. It's super presumptuous. I have no idea what you think about the Beatles, but hopefully it got your attention. This isn't going to be a negative video at all. I just kind of want to talk about what the Beatles mean to different generations and different age groups, and also kind of push back against the trend I've seen in the last few years among certain people to really hate on them, and kind of just talk about why I think even if you don't like the Beatles, you should still appreciate them, especially if you play rock music. So if you like rock, heavy metal, hard rock, progressive rock, folk, any kind of music, go ahead, like, comment, subscribe to this channel. I know it's a cliche to ask, but it really does help the channel grow, so I appreciate it. Thank you in advance for that, and hopefully we'll have a nice little community of music lovers here pretty soon. So with that out of the way, let's just get right into it. And the Beatles, depending on who you ask, are either the greatest thing to ever exist ever, or, if you ask some people, they might just be the worst, most overrated band that did nothing but make horrific, horrible, terrible music, and they should be hated. You've probably heard that first opinion, it's kind of the consensus, but you might not be too familiar with that second opinion, but evidence of it can be seen in memes like this, and this one. And going beyond the memes, I've met plenty of people, musicians included, who typically tend to be a few years younger than me, who just actively hate the Beatles. And I'm not talking about like just dislike them or they're not one of their favorite bands. I mean, they hate them with a passion. And I can understand why someone who's even younger than me might think the Beatles are overrated, or someone who doesn't really know the history of rock music, or someone who's not a musician might just hear the Beatles and be like, yeah, they're not for me. And if they had their parents playing the Beatles constantly when they were a kid, they might kind of grow to resent them as a form of rebellion. I get all that. I also understand why you may be a little annoyed with the reputation that John Lennon has if you think he doesn't deserve that reputation. All that's completely fair. One thing I just can't understand is why musicians, especially musicians who play rock or progressive rock or even heavy metal, would actively hate and despise the Beatles. Admittedly, this isn't a majority of musicians, but I have met enough musicians in general that share this view in person that it's kind of something I wanted to address. And my goal with this is not to convince you that the Beatles should be your favorite band or that you're wrong for not worshiping them. They certainly aren't my favorite band. There's a lot of other musicians that I would rather listen to than the Beatles, but hopefully in my ramblings you'll find something to appreciate that you didn't know before, and not just with the Beatles, but just with the process of making music in general. And also, if you are one of these few people that just hates the Beatles for some reason, hopefully I'll say some things here that kind of convince you like, hey, that's kind of a waste of time, because to be honest, there's so much casual hatred out there in the world and on social media in particular, and it's kind of a fucking waste of time. With that preamble out of the way, let's just get right into the first reason why I think anyone, especially musicians, should appreciate the Beatles, and that is they took rock and roll out of the 1950s. If you're in the modern day and you're listening to bands like Alter Bridge or Paramore or whatever modern rock band is out there, and then you decide to put on something like Elvis or Chuck Berry, you're probably going to feel like this is not even the same genre of music. But if you go from listening to that to Beatles albums like Revolver or Rubber Soul or Abbey Road or the White Album or Let It Be, you're gonna be able to tell that even if you don't like the Beatles songs, this is still the same genre of music. They still belong together. There's more similarities than there are differences. And that's because more than any other individual group, the Beatles really did take rock music and modernize it into what we know it as today. Of course, rock has a long history before the Beatles. I'm not saying they invented it. They didn't. Of course, it comes back all the way to the 1940s with jazz, ragtime, R&B, blues, and it had a long history before the Beatles came along, but as I said, there's clearly a definitive shift when you listen to the stuff in the 1950s to the stuff that was going on in the 1960s. The Beatles themselves started out as a band that was pretty similar to what was going on at the time in the 50s, and by the end, in the 1960s and the early 1970s, you have songs like Let It Be, She's So Heavy, Something, A Day in the Life. All of these still sound pretty modern, even 50 years later. So with regards to rock in general, if the musicians who came before them, like Elvis or Chuck Berry, Muddy Waters, were the Black Sabbath of rock, then the Beatles were Iron Maiden, Motorhead, Metallica. They took the foundation that had been laid and they morphed it into what we know today. A second aspect about the Beatles I think is really worthy of respect is just how groundbreaking their songwriting and the production of their albums was. Anyone who's actually taken the time to try to record music will tell you that it is a completely different game and an art and a science of itself. You might be the greatest guitar player that's ever lived, but if you never sat down in a studio and recorded anything, it doesn't matter how good you are not going to be able to get how you sound onto that record. And George Martin, who produced most of the Beatles albums, is kind of like the Eddie Van Halen of production. He modernized so many things, he changed the game. If you listen to stuff that was produced before him and stuff that was produced after, so many of the same techniques are still being used today that he helped develop and that he experimented with. And there were a lot of other bands doing a lot of really cool, interesting things at the time, and technology was advancing in a way so that new production techniques could be used in music and you can record things differently. But George Martin is still the guy who kind of brought it all together and created what we know today. And talking more specifically about the songwriting of the Beatles, there's a lot of things in modern day music that you can trace back to them. For example, have you ever been listening to a heavy metal band and they are chugging out to a riff that sounds vaguely Middle Eastern and it has this raised third and it sounds all sinister and evil and you're like, oh, I don't know what that is, but it doesn't sound like something you would hear in most Western pop music. And it might sound ridiculous, but I think you can trace that back to what the Beatles were doing in the 60s. George Harrison using a sitar on Norwegian wood and his love of traditional Indian music and taking that and mixing it with pop music for the West. It really exposed a lot of people to the ideas that you can have different sounds, different instruments, different scales, and make it work within a Western pop music context. Another thing that we might take for granted today, but the Beatles were doing back in the 1960s, is having string instruments and having an entire orchestra on some of your songs. Take, for example, A Day in the Life, where halfway through the song there's just an entire orchestra and it's a completely different song going on. You know, we might take things like that for granted today and we might be listening to progressive metal or even pop music and, oh yeah, they have a string section for this song, but that took a lot of effort back then, and it was not something that had really been done before. And it is entirely possible that these developments would have happened without the Beatles. If they weren't around, maybe some other band would have done them, or maybe they just would have happened over time as a result of the world becoming smaller and technology bringing us together. But the fact remains, they were one of the first bands doing it, and they were definitely the biggest band doing it. So they were really exposing a lot of people and a lot of future musicians to ideas and ways of doing things that had never been thought of before. Even just the idea that if you're in a rock band you should have long hair, or if you're in a heavy metal band you should have long hair, that was something that was not heard of before the Beatles came along. And of course there's a lot of other factors. Nothing exists in a vacuum. All of us are products of our time, but still though, the Beatles do deserve a lot of credit for making all these things sort of commonplace. And they did all of this in just about 10 years of being together, which brings me to another aspect about the Beatles that I think everyone, especially aspiring songwriters and musicians, should appreciate and respect. And that is their absolutely insane work ethic. Think about it, in just 7 years they released 12 albums, more if you count re-releases or singles or little EPs they did. That is absolutely nuts. In those 7 years, just Paul McCartney and John Lennon alone wrote about 180 songs. That doesn't take into account the other songs that other members wrote, or the fact that all 4 members had pretty prolific solo careers after the Beatles broke up. And when you break that down, 180 songs just between Paul McCartney and John Lennon over the course of 7 years, that's having to write and record a song once every 2 weeks on average. That is not easy. And like I said, that doesn't even include all the other songs they wrote together. And someone who really hates the Beatles might say something like, yeah, but their songs sucked. It's really easy to write songs that are crap. I could have done that. And to that, I would say, even the worst song you've ever heard, the song that you hate the most, took a lot more work to get in the studio and record it than it does to criticize it. I mean, even if it's not a very good song, you still have to record the guitars, you gotta record the drums, the bass, you gotta double track, you have to have the vocal harmonies, you have to have a melody, you have to package it, you have to release it. There's a lot of work that goes into creating just one song, even if it's not a good one. And the sheer scale of the Beatles' catalog, combined with how fast they grew as musicians, if you listen to their early stuff versus the stuff they were doing at the end, they are an entirely different band. And I think that that's something else you should admire if you're a musician or a songwriter. Just always trying to grow and be better and incorporate new styles of music into your own songwriting. Another reason to respect and appreciate the Beatles, even if you don't like their music, is the fact that in their contract they had it that they would never play to a segregated audience. If they're performing to their fans, they're making sure all their fans are being treated equally, and standing up to bigotry and racism, valuing your fellow human being over money, that's something that's always worthy of respect. So hopefully if you were just sort of ambivalent to the Beatles or you actively hated them, this kind of gives you something to appreciate even if you don't like their music. Like I said before, the Beatles are not one of my favorite bands, and I'm not trying to convince you they should be your favorite band, but when I see people just hating something, casually hating something too, with like memes and just trash talking it, and especially when it's something like the Beatles, I don't just see it as them casually hating the Beatles, I see them as them casually putting down how much work it takes to be a musician. And some people might say, oh, well, you know, these memes are just trying to encourage people to look up other bands because the Beatles overshadow a lot of amazing bands from that same era. And, you know, I'd sort of agree with that because I'd rather listen to King Crimson than the Beatles, and I wish more people knew about King Crimson. But in none of those memes did they mention any other bands, did they? It's a little weird. So maybe they're not exactly trying to expand people's minds, they're just trying to hate on something popular, which quite frankly, pretty boring. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of popular musicians out there that I'm not really a big fan of, but I don't get the idea of wanting to just spend your time hating something. Every second you spend hating something is 1 second less you have to enjoy something you like. Also, for me personally, I don't feel like you have to put someone else down in order to raise someone else up. If I'm getting a compliment, but it means someone else has to get insulted, I don't want that compliment. It's not really a compliment either, it's just more of a warning that, hey, you're next. And if you're watching this video and you're still one of those few musicians that's like, no, I hate the Beatles and I will continue to hate the Beatles, I just wanted to leave you with this. Ozzy Osbourne, Freddie Mercury, Mike Portnoy, Rob Halford, Serge Tankian, Darren Malakian, Geddy Lee, Chris Cornell, Taylor Momsen, R.J. Hale, Miles Kennedy, Stuart Copeland, Billy Corgan, Ann Wilson, Charlie Benante, Lady Gaga, Phil Collins, and Kurt Cobain, along with tons of other amazing musicians, have all cited the Beatles as either their favorite band, one of their favorite bands, or the reason they play music. So if all those amazing musicians found something about the Beatles that they loved, there's probably something there. And if you're choosing to hate on the Beatles, you're probably missing out on it. Hate is like a drug. It feels good in the moment, but it really doesn't do anything for you in the long run. Even if it's casually just hating on something or saying something sucks, it's damaging in ways you might not realize. I certainly don't hate you though, especially if you watch this entire video of me just sort of rambling. I know it's like a big stance I'm taking. Hey, the Beatles are kind of cool. Fucking radical hot take there, right? Man, these Beatles, I think they might go places. I also just realized this entire video is basically me being like, all I'm saying is, give peace a chance, all you need is love. As always though, thank you so much for watching this video, and if you want to like, comment, subscribe to the channel, all that YouTube stuff, I'd really appreciate it. I also have a new instrumental song. If you want to check it out, there's a link below. And there's also a link below to my Instagram if you want to follow me on there. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you at the next video. Peace.